Hello and welcome to my presentation on the systematic review of the literature on masculinity and the nosology and etiology of muscle dysmorphia. So what is muscle dysmorphia? Muscle dysmorphia is a dangerous and obsessive drive to increase size and muscularity. It has a few important behavioural features. Disordered eating, rigid fitness regime, body checking, similar to body dysmorphia, and avoiding social situations because of these factors. In really serious instances as well, it can escalate to use of illegal steroids, unregulated and without medical support. And even in really bad situations, self-harm and suicide. In fact, one research study showed that 50% of those with a clinical diagnosis will attempt suicide at some point in their lives. There are also a number of cognitive features of muscle dysmorphia. Global low self-esteem, high perfectionism, a dysmorphic perspective, so what they see in the mirror might be very different from what an outside observer might see. Emotional dysregulation, and alongside that a lack of emotional regulation capacity or strategies as well. Conditional self-worth, so that means that their self-worth is very much tied into their physique. And suicidal ideation. So it's a very serious condition. Essential to our understanding of muscle dysmorphia at the moment is this nosology debate. So the categorisation of muscle dysmorphia, where does it sit? The DSM-5, published in 2015, places it as a subcategory of body dysmorphia, but this has been debated extensively. And actually, a systematic review of the literature showed that nearly zero of the latest research projects actually use the DSM-5 categorization in their research. And a growing argument is for it to be categorized as an eating disorder. And interestingly, because this debate is ongoing, we don't have a conclusion yet. There is potential for new theories and new approaches to come in that might, if not settle that debate, then at least better place the condition. So in terms of the etiology, at the moment we have a medical model which very much focuses on the pathological individual, and it's tautological, it's criticised for this, because the main factor, the main antecedent is considered to be a drive for muscularity, which is kind of baked into the definition of what muscle dysmorphia is. And there's very little consideration of social psychology or culture, all these other push and pull factors. And only recently, actually, are masculine constructs being considered as an area of research that might help to explain more about the etiology and the nosology as well. So is masculinity the missing piece of the puzzle? It is primarily a male pathology, so some research shows up to 90% of people who have muscle dysmorphia are men, and there's a well-documented mental health crisis among men. And part of that is underreporting. So the numbers might actually be a lot higher than we think. And 3/4 of suicides in the UK were men in 2022, and that's from the Office of National Statistics, a very reliable source. It's a really shocking stat, that. So there is a lot of research done that shows that disordered body attitudes are at a similar level with men as they are with women. There hasn't yet been a male iteration of eating disorder pathology, so perhaps masculinity might be the missing piece of the puzzle that joins muscle dysmorphia to eating disorders. And at the moment, research is really disparate. And shockingly, there has been no research into any effective treatments for muscle dysmorphia. Everything is borrowed from other conditions at the moment. So that really does justify the need for a synthesis of the existing information that's out there. Which leads us to the research question, which is how does masculinity affect the nosology and etiology of muscle dysmorphia in people who identify as men? So how did we go about it? We decided on a systematic review because this is an embryonic field and there hasn't been much synthesis done yet, particularly when we look at masculinity. And this is an exploratory study, and we used a narrative synthesis approach for the discussion. There was 2 researchers that took part in the methodology and the actual research and gathering of data, and then we separated and created individual projects from that information. So we identified databases, used our search terms, and searched for papers, and then we used a really rigorous multi-stage exclusion process as defined by PRISMA, the gold standard of systematic reviews. And we did each stage separately. And the reason for doing that was to try and take as much risk of bias and subjectivity out of this process as possible. And then at the end of each stage, we'd come together and we'd discuss any differences we had in our exclusions based on the criteria that we had defined at the start of the process. From that, we managed to whittle down our 1,316 papers to a final 12 papers, which were then assessed for quality and bias, and then analysed and pulled apart to create our results section. So some of the main findings we had, really significantly, masculine norms did predict muscle dysmorphia, and far more so than they predicted body dysmorphia or anorexia nervosa. Masculine norms predicted masculine discrepancy stress, and that one actually went both ways. The interesting thing there is that high norm adherence doesn't necessarily mean that that person has a high estimation of their own masculinity, and that's a really key point. Masculine discrepancy stress is going to come up time and time again in this paper. Masculine discrepancy stress actually has the strongest association with muscle dysmorphic symptoms and severity out of all of the masculine factors. And underlying this, actually, it seemed that emotional dysregulation with a lack of regulation capacity really did predict discrepancy stress and muscle dysmorphia. Another paper found that muscle dysmorphia is used to manage the negative effect that masculine discrepancy stress can create in place of a functional coping strategy. Some other really interesting bits of information that popped out. 50% of 14-year-old boys are considering using steroids, illegal anabolic steroids, potentially dangerous, potentially deadly steroids. 90% of those surveyed in one paper had reported problematic relationships with the father figure. 90%, really significant number there. And there was a strong adherence to specific masculine norms as related to muscle dysmorphia. And those were violence, control over women, emotional control, and homophobia and heterosexual presentation. And what we found is that there's a severe psychological dysfunction and norm internalization that is below the surface. What we may see as the tip of the iceberg, the bit that's visible is the symptoms and the behaviors, but underneath that there's a whole host of complex processes and dysfunctions that are going on. And it was also worth noting that muscle dysmorphia exists on a spectrum, and there's discomfort at all points, which is really important for assessing the kind of the antecedents and the origins of muscle dysmorphia, and also looking at subclinical variations of muscle dysmorphia as well. There were some significant limitations. There was very little diversity. All but one of the papers were published and used populations from Australia, the United States, or the UK. And there's a severe lack of sexuality and gender identity diversity. Most of the studies were cross-sectional, so it's not very useful for looking at longitudinal patterns and relationships, and really does limit our ability to look at the real kind of trigger factors and risk populations. Very limited qualitative data, and also a lack of clinical populations. So we're working with limited data here, and that needs to be taken into consideration in the discussion. So masculinity and nosology. Nosology is really important because it can dictate which conditions get funding, what the clinical utility is, how we work with people, what treatments we use, what the underlying nature of the condition is, what comorbidities we might come to expect, how we identify at-risk populations. All of this stuff is really integral to our understanding. And in terms of the eating disorder or body dysmorphic disorder debate, masculinity and the results don't really actually settle that debate. What we find instead is that perhaps it can supplement and feed into those categorizations. What is clear, though, is that any categorization of muscle dysmorphia that doesn't include masculinity is absolutely incomplete. And in terms of nosology evolution, there's an issue with the DSM-5 and the ICD-10. There's a few issues, really, but one specific to how we incorporate masculinity into our understanding of the nosology of the condition of muscle dysmorphia is that it discounts socio-cultural factors. It's very pathologically and biologically reductive, and the categorizations are very restrictive. So we looked at a few alternatives that were out there that might better be able to integrate masculine constructs and norms and masculine discrepancy stress. The spectrum model was very interesting because that can take into account subclinical variations. It doesn't have that strict cutoff point where someone is either pathological or not. There's socio-cultural and political models that look at, the bigger, wider context. And there's also sociological and social psychology models, which look at more at the community and those media push-pull factors as well. And all of that really feeds into this work that Murray is doing, who does actually work specifically with eating disorders and muscle dysmorphia. And he has come across something that he calls the transdiagnostic model, which currently doesn't take masculinity into account, but in terms of the structure of the model, could be a really interesting way forward to be able to incorporate some of these other factors into our understanding of muscle dysmorphia and where it sits. So masculinity and the etiology. Again, the wider literature is really narrow and incomplete on this. The etiology at the moment, the literature does acknowledge emotional dysregulation coupled with a lack of regulation ability, interoceptive dysfunction, low self-esteem and hyperfectionism. And the results really do suggest that all of these factors may be really intricately entwined with masculine norms, gender compatibility and masculine discrepancy stress. And another theory is the etiological theory of internalization of the kind of physical ideal. And actually masculinity really fits into that as well, because we can look at the masculine ideal as a kind of physical representation of traditional masculine values of strength and virility and all this kind of stuff. And what we kind of found from looking at the results was actually it looks like there's a consensus here that threatened masculinity can cause masculine discrepancy stress. And in the absence of emotional regulation strategies, muscle dysmorphia can then become a compensatory behavior. So to look at that in a little bit more of a kind of visual way, we have a threatened masculinity event. So that could be childhood bullying related to masculinity, something like that. It could be something to do with criticism from a paternal figure about one's masculinity. This causes masculine discrepancy stress and emotional dysregulation. And where we have a lack of emotional regulation strategies, a drive for muscularity can be used then to manage that negative effect. And this can eventually lead to full clinical muscle dysmorphia. But as we say, it does exist on a spectrum and there will be discomfort at all points in this process. So it's something that is starting at actually quite a young age and developing. And the thing is that it's cyclical as well, because we find that muscle dysmorphic behavior doesn't actually reduce negative effect or regulate emotions. It can actually increase that, and it can actually also increase masculine discrepancy stress. So we end up in a vicious cycle. And all of this is underlain by a strong adherence or internalization of traditional masculine messaging from all kinds of different places, from media, society, politics, religion, and even in the family as well. And this is an embryonic kind of model. It needs a lot more research, but there's definitely some interesting questions arise from it. So how would that model fit into other models? There's the psychosocial model of Begin, and there's the eating disorder model. And alongside the BDD body dysmorphic model that we discussed earlier. And actually, rather than replacing these models, it looks like actually in terms of etiology, it's going to be quite a good fit in actually just adding depth and understanding to these models and in understanding the risk factors and maybe even identifying at-risk populations and finding really like different time periods in which we might be able to intervene to be able to have effective preventative and ultimately curative strategies. So threatened masculinity and discrepancy, this is an interesting one because wider research suggests that it's 16 to 19 years old at which muscle dysmorphia forms. But the results suggest it can actually happen a lot earlier. And masculinity-related victimization in childhood may be a cause of the discrepancy, which then results in muscle dysmorphia. This model fits really well with the victimization model of Wolke and Sapuna. An example of that is that bullying, violence, sexual abuse, adverse sporting experiences where masculinity is criticized, late pubertal onset, all of these different activating masculinity threat events can be triggering events for masculine discrepancy stress. On the flip side, research shows in the results that masculine affirming events cause a decrease in symptoms and threatening events cause an increase in symptoms, and that even goes on into adulthood. And systems seem to desist when masculinity becomes secure. So that's really interesting in terms of how we might be able to work with the etiology and at-risk populations. And underlying all of this is emotional dysregulation. A really quite a scary piece of information is that masculine discrepancy in intimate partner violence was mediated 100% of the time by emotional dysregulation. That was founded by a study in 2016. And it raises the question, what other dysfunctional coping mechanisms and behaviours and dangerous behaviours do we have out there that might be due to masculine discrepancy, stress, and a lack of emotional regulation? The mind boggles. Neoliberalism, masculine-dominated working environments, and all of the different types of violence enacted almost exclusively by men. So, on to the most important part of this really, what do we do with this information? So in terms of theory, I think we can conclude with some security, although this is still an embryonic research area, that masculinity is really closely associated with the onset, symptomology, and nosology of muscle dysmorphia. It's really under-recognised and under-researched. There's a lack of longitudinal studies, specifically qualitative and quantitative, and perhaps even mixed methods studies are needed to better understand these specific relationships and mediation models. And the masculine discrepancy model of muscle dysmorphia, while being in very early stages, something that I've come up with through looking through these results and through synthesizing the information available, it does need a lot more research. And integration of masculinity into the existing models of etiology and nosology is definitely needed, whilst also maybe looking at what kind of nosological model is best suited to look at these socio-culturally informed conditions. We really need to look at the individual in the context of society, politics, and culture. And we need to look at underlying traditional and toxic masculine behaviours. Maybe underneath these behaviours, there's severe psychological dysfunction. And a really interesting point is that a consideration of toxic masculinity, as we call it, as a mental health issue may be of interest, because no research paper could be found with this approach. If we consider the individual to be the first victim, what is the impact on those around the individual and society at large? I'm looking at things like intimate partner violence, patriarchy, neoliberalism, colonialism, business over environment. This is very speculative and a lot of research is needed here, but it raises some really interesting questions around masculine discrepancy, stress, emotional dysregulation, threatened masculinity, and really people who could be considered to be quite psychologically unwell. Further research with a more diverse population is also needed, and that is in terms of country, race, culture, but also sexuality and gender as well. And what does that mean in the counselling room? As previously touched upon, no existing research into muscle dysmorphia treatments exists. They're borrowed from other conditions like body dysmorphia and eating disorders. So one of the main treatments at the moment is CBT, and there is a very clear and distinct cognitive and behavioural aspect to this condition. So further research is definitely warranted there, but there's some specific approaches that emerge from this research that I will very tentatively and cautiously recommend. More research is needed and always adhere to best practice because this is an early stage of research. But things like deconstructing and challenging rigid forms of masculinity could be really beneficial. Working directly with that masculine discrepancy stress and the internalized masculine self-concept. We need to be challenging internalized media and cultural narratives around masculinity. And if we can also be addressing the underlying causes of emotional dysregulation and provide some more functional emotional regulation strategies so that it maybe isn't, the negative effect doesn't have to be dealt with a dysfunctional output such as muscle dysmorphia. We can also be improving the client's interoceptive awareness and emotional intelligence through appropriate exercises, exploring activating events to build self-awareness and empathy regarding adverse childhood experiences. This is really important, building empathy and acceptance for that rather than it seeing it as a threat to their own masculinity. Exploring the paternal object and father or male role model, building global self-esteem. And of particular urgency is working with at-risk young people. It looks like this starts a lot younger than is currently being addressed. So psychosocial education within schools or other networks, and with adult patients, partly because of the stigma, it's so important that clinicians can recognise muscle dysmorphia, recognise the risk factors, and work with them in an appropriate manner. All of these recommendations are cautiously recommended considering the research landscape, and further research is needed. So, closing thoughts. This review doesn't really provide many clear answers given the paucity of research. It does, however, support a really convincing argument for a specific clinical and theoretical focus on masculinity and muscle dysmorphia. Dysfunctional emotional regulation, masculine discrepancy stress, and internalized masculine constructs may be at the very heart of muscle dysmorphia. We can speculate as to their effects on many other issues as well. Further research is needed, but it's clearly a really exciting and cutting-edge area of research. Anyway, thank you so much for listening. Questions and collaboration are very much welcome.